Order.
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon or good morning, members. Minister statement. Minister Quitlan Goodani, the Minister in Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories has significant and varied energy resources. As Canada's gas and liquefied natural gas industry takes steps towards competing in the global market, the Northwest Territories' resources are positioned to both improve energy security locally and help Canada compete. The responsible development of these resources will also create meaningful jobs for residents, opportunities for business, and sources of revenue to support territory-wide public programs and services for NWT residents. In particular, the Northwest Territories petroleum resources offer a frontier for exploration and represent in their development and delivery to market significant opportunities to grow and diversify our economy. In time, our natural gas resources will also contribute to regional energy security, lessen our reliance on imported diesel, reduce the energy costs, and lower Northwest Territories' greenhouse gas emissions. None of this will happen overnight. Realizing the benefits of the Northwest Territories petroleum resources will take time, commitment, and innovation, all of which, Mr. Speaker, we have. On May 1st, as part of our government's transition to a strong, healthy economy, one in which the Northwest Territories residents and communities are resilient and adaptive in the face of changing climate, the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment introduced a petroleum resource strategy as committed in our mandate. The Northwest Territories petroleum resources, a path to northern benefits and energy security, presents a balanced, viable and made in the Northwest Territories approach to advancing petroleum development in the NWT for the benefit of all residents. Its aim is to realize both short and long-term economic benefits of the Territories' petroleum resources, positioning and preparing the Northwest Territories to realize eventual industry investment while pursuing local energy security and advancing our growing knowledge economy. The Petroleum Resource Strategy, Mr. Speaker, is framed by a family of GNWT strategies and policies, including the Northwest Territories 2030 Energy Strategy and the Northwest Territories Climate Change and Strategic Framework. It outlines actions to improve the Northwest Territories' competitive edge for investment, including support for infrastructure projects that facilitate activity in the Northwest Territories petroleum resources sector, and improvements to the Northwest Territories oil and gas regulatory framework, and investment in greater public understanding and awareness. It also highlights opportunities to provide locally produced energy to communities, build the Northwest Territories workforce and business capacity, and take an active role in the governments of offshore oil and gas policy and co-management. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we will work through the implementation of this strategy to create a sustainable, innovative petroleum resource sector by ensuring decisions about the development of the Northwest Territories petroleum resources consider both science and traditional knowledge, and by encouraging the application of knowledge economy to petroleum resources. Mr. Speaker, access to secure, affordable, and environmentally sustainable sources of energy is essential to the prosperity of the Northwest Territories, and everyone has a part to play in achieving a more sustainable territory. I look forward to working with colleagues, stakeholders, and Indigenous governments to implement this pursuit of economic opportunity and prosperity on behalf of all residents of the Northwest Territories. Later today, at the appropriate time, I will be tabling this strategy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister Ike Goodani, the Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As the federal government implements its plan to legalize cannabis this summer, the Department of Health and Social Services, in partnership with other government of the Northwest Territories departments and agencies, has already begun public education and awareness efforts. Mr. Speaker, in late April, we launched our campaign in order to equip residents with the health information they need to make informed decisions about cannabis use. While all Northwest Territories residents will be provided with cannabis-related health information, groups that are especially at risk for harm from cannabis will be our immediate focus. This includes youth under 25, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and those at risk for adverse mental health outcomes. Mr. Speaker, this will not be an easy task. The challenge for us is in striking the right balance and providing information about the very real health risks associated with cannabis products, while acknowledging that residents will soon have the option to legally purchase and consume cannabis. Our goal is to provide residents with evidence-based and culturally appropriate harm reduction information on safer cannabis use so that they can feel confident in their ability to make informed health decisions. Like other controlled substances, there are risks associated with cannabis use that people should be aware of. We know that cannabis use negatively impacts brain development in infants and young people, possibly up to an age of 25. For this reason, some of our most important audiences for this education and awareness campaign are youth, their parents, and youth influencers. To this end, we provide residents with the Cannabis Talk Kit, Know How to Talk to Your Teen, a publication from Drug Free Kids Canada endorsed by Health Canada. This simple talk kit was sent to all households and businesses in the Northwest Territories. Over 13,000 kits were distributed to help start and guide the conversation regarding cannabis use. The kit is one of many initiatives that will raise awareness regarding cannabis use. To make sure that the important information in the Cannabis Talk Kit reaches all residents, we have worked with local translators to provide a summary of the kit in all of our Indigenous languages. These translations are currently airing on local and commercial radio stations and are available on the Department of Health and Social Services website. Other elements of our public education and awareness campaign include social media and newspaper advertising, videos, and posters that will provide fact-based health messaging for our target audiences. Our work with the schools and educators is an important part of how we are working together as a government and with our partners to make sure that our youth are getting the important information about cannabis. On June 11, 2018, a brain expert from the University of Calgary will host a live video conference questions and answer session with students and educators in schools across the Northwest Territories on the effects of cannabis on the brain. Similar information sessions are also being provided to health professionals in Northwest Territories recreation leaders on how to talk to youth and people who use cannabis about the health effects. As community healthy living fairs begin in the fall, we also have materials available for wider public. We hope that these new resources and activities will prompt further discussion in our communities and in our homes. Mr. Speaker, ensuring that our young people and residents have the most up-to-date information on cannabis is not a one-time effort. We know that we will need to continue to be a trusted source of information for residents and that this will require longer-term planning and dedicated resources. That is why the Department of Health and Social Services has submitted a detailed multi-year funding proposal to the federal government that will allow us to expand our campaign to support even more public education activities in communities. Part of the proposal will help us identify community champions and provide information to our communities in culturally appropriate ways. This would be in addition to the scheduled community healthy living fairs that will take place this fall, which provide healthy choices, advice, and information directly to communities. We applaud the work that the federal government has begun on cannabis public education, including using social media, paid advertising, and promotional materials, all of which is helping to provide important information to residents of the Northwest Territories as well as across the country. We hope to leverage this campaign and extend our own campaign. Our government is committed to making sure that NWT residents and communities have the information that they need to educate themselves and their children in order to make informed decisions on cannabis use. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godani, the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce the release of an action plan to support the 2017 NWT Aboriginal Languages Framework. The Northwest Territories Indigenous Languages Action Plan has two goals. The first is language revitalization, with efforts intended to slow down, stop, and reverse the decline of Indigenous languages in the Northwest Territories. The second goal is to improve people's access to public services in the 9 Indigenous official languages of the Northwest Territories: Inuvialuktun, Innu Inaktuun, and Inuktitut, Witchin, North Slavey, South Slavey, Clecho, Chippewan, and Cree. Mr. Speaker, the Framework and Action Plan together support the 18th Legislative Assembly's priority of increasing cultural programming in education. Oh, shit. I'm missing a page. I apologize, Mr. Speaker. I am missing a page from my document. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to try to find where we are mentoring. I can't believe this just happened. Mr. Speaker, the framework is now in the future. In education, Mr. Speaker, the Framework and Action Plan together support the 18th Legislative Assembly's priority of increasing cultural programming in education and revitalizing Indigenous languages. Indigenous languages are essential to the history, culture, and traditions of the Northwest Territories. They are vital to the identity, well-being, and prosperity of Northwest Territories residents now and in the future. Can I have the rest of it? Revitalizing Indigenous languages is an enormous task, one that takes the effort and commitment of many people: parents, families, and language communities, Indigenous governments and non-government organizations, early childhood programs, schools, and post-secondary institutions, language representatives, boards, and the government of the Northwest Territories all share a responsibility for strengthening Indigenous languages. Mr. Speaker, our investment in Indigenous languages has increased to $21 million this past year, which includes $5.9 million from Canadian Heritage as part of a multi-year funding agreement. We provided a total of $4.8 million last year to Indigenous governments to design and deliver Indigenous language programming in their communities. This amount includes support for Indigenous languages in early childhood programs. A further $10.6 million was invested in Indigenous languages and culture-based education in schools. 40 language partners were supported in taking Canadian Indigenous Languages and Literacy Development Institute courses through the University of Alberta to increase the quality and success of their local Indigenous language programming. The new Revitalizing Indigenous Languages and Communities program provided multi-year funding to innovative, community-based Indigenous language learning and revitalization training programs, such as the Elder and Youth Language Mentoring Programs and Family Language Learning Initiatives. As well, we continue to support community radio stations across the territory to provide Indigenous language programming. Our schools are doing their part towards achieving the action plan goals. 19 schools piloted the new Our Language curriculum this school year. We will be piloting the program in all Northwest Territories schools beginning in September 2018. This means students in all schools will hear and use Indigenous languages during their school routines and in interactions with staff and other students. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the Official Languages Board and the Aboriginal Languages Board, many of whom are here today. They played a vital role in the completion of the NWT Indigenous Languages Action Plan, a shared responsibility. Mr. Speaker, we must act now to revitalize Indigenous languages in the Northwest Territories and improve access to public services in Indigenous official languages. Our government is committed to meeting these goals, together with our key language partners. We are working with them to achieve a shared vision where Indigenous languages are supported, respected, and thriving. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godin, the Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to offer our sincere thanks to the many people and groups who are involved in the 2018 Arctic Winter Games held in the South Slave region from March 18th to March 24th. I acknowledge Mr. Greg Rowe, President of the Arctic Winter Games Society, his dedicated board of directors and staff whose efforts over many months resulted in the delivery of a very successful Games. All Northwest Territories residents should be proud. I would also like to recognize Mayor Lynn Napier-Buckley of Fort Smith, Mayor Brad Mapes of Hay River, and Chief Roy Fabian of the Kaplo-Daichi First Nation for being tremendous hosts to the athletes, coaches, mission staff, cultural delegates, and visitors from across the circumpolar region. One of the many benefits of hosting the Arctic Winter Games is the infrastructure legacy that the community receives afterwards. This year, we saw investments in Hay River Airport, the new arena, and upgrades to the snowboard park, which residents will be able to enjoy for many years to come. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to congratulate Mr. Doug Rentmeister, Chef de Mission, and his staff. They helped us 350-plus members of Team NT make a great showing in 19 different sports, with our athletes bringing home 102 ulus. I'm sure that all members of this House will join me to thank the many parents and volunteers who helped make the 2018 South Slave Arctic Winter Games a success. Hosting an event of this scale in one community is a large feat, but hosting across the region required an amazing effort for many people in the South Slave. Congratulations to all those who supported these games by opening your homes to visitors, volunteering at events, or by attending and cheering on the participants. As volunteers, you are the heart of our communities, and without you, these games simply do not happen. On behalf of all members, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to extend my appreciation to all of the members who took time from their busy schedules to take part in the Arctic Winter Games. You only have the opportunity to host this event every decade or so. Having a strong show of support from this House for our athletes and cultural performers demonstrates our commitment to the young people of the Northwest Territories. They are our future. There's also still some work to be done to wrap up the 2018 Arctic Winter Games. Currently, many who are involved in the different aspects of the Games are supporting the completion of an economic impact study. Its findings will help demonstrate the economic effects this event had on the South Slave region. Studies of this nature reflect the need for us to continue to support the Arctic Winter Games and to invest in our economy in all parts of the Northwest Territories. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would once more invite all of my colleagues to join me in offering our thanks to all of those who were involved in the 2018 Arctic Winter Games for a job well done. Masi Cho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent to go to item 5 on the orders paper.
Masi. Member seeking unanimous consent to move item number 5 up after minister's statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you can see, we have a full gallery today. It's the annual grade 6 class trip. The gallery is full of students from Princess Alexandra School, and we're happy to have them. We have a long list of names here, and I want to make sure I don't want to miss anyone. So let's get started here. Students, we have Ashley Annalik Elder, Chase Beck, Emerson Beck, Esha O'Brien, Caden Brodner, Jaydan Brown, Glacia Gordon, Tegan Henderson, Kaiser Heen, Angelia Nitzia, Nora Lacuter, Tegan Lefebvre, Theron Mabbitt, Grace Schaub, Joshua Cayenne, Sienna Daniels, Aaliyah Famercon, Lincoln Giesbrit, Teddy LaFleur, Angela Merez, Tyrell Thomas Como, and we have chaperones as well. Wayne Cortash, Reverend Francis Delaplane, Stephanie Haas, Miranda Orr, and Joe Gagne, who got them all here safely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River South.
Mr. Speaker, and as the member stated, we have students from Hay River, our growing population, because he only read half of the people that are here. And I'd like to introduce 24 other participants. Cale Beck, Dawson Burke, Tyler Brockway, Kira Coakwell, Zoe Cross, Addison Cortage, Brenda Makepeace, Emma Peters, James Graham, Brooke Delory, Marie Buggins, Albert Jensen, Alana Klaus, Hayden Braun, Tegan Brockway, Lainey McPhee, Ava Pokiak, Dominic Sim, Peyton Walters, Liam McIntyre, chaperone Colleen Cochran, and Darlene Lamb, and also Pauline West and Lynette Moore, and also YCA Myrtle Graham. And I'd like to wish happy birthday to Pauline, Lynette, and Myrtle today as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. I also like to recognize Tammy DeChambeau, my Edzo neighbor, and also a good friend as well. I call her Dr. James nowadays. So thank you for coming. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I'd like to recognize our language board members who are here in the gallery. Tammy Signwand Deschambeau, Jonas Laundrie, Deanna Marie Jacobson, Emily Kudluk, Richard Letourneau, Vance Sanderson, Angie Lance, Sarah Gargan, Bella Selly, Betty Elias, Joshua Oliptoak, Karen Mitchell, Mary Cardinal, Mary Rose Sunberg. I want to thank each of you for sharing your expertise and stepping forward in our efforts to revitalize and strengthen our languages. Thank you.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Sabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize my wife, Anne, who has traveled from Wami, Fort Smith, to be here with us today. Thank you.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize some people in the gallery today. Two members of the language board that are from Trinidad-Willowday, and Angie Lance and Moreau Sunberg. I'd like to recognize Vance Sanderson. He's father of my grandson, Cy Sanderson. I'd like to recognize Zoe Bollier Cross, my great niece from Hay River. I'd like to recognize an interpreter for us this week, Tom Oncap from Port Resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to the House 3 pages from my riding of Cam Lake, Mr. Kyle Rogers, Ms. Lydia Taylor, and Ms. Rowena Javier. Thank you very much for serving with us today.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize the board members of the language program, and also in particular Bella Tassili from my home community in Fort Good Hope. Welcome. Thank you.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Nunakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also would like to recognize the language board members. Welcome to everybody, especially three of my constituents, Josh Oliptoak from Uluhuktuk, Emily Kudluk from Uluhuktuk, and Betty Elias from Tuktoyaktuk, as well as my relative Ann Peters, who's somewhere in here. Welcome everybody and have a good weekend. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife South.
To recognize Paige from Yellowknife South, Jada Dow, and also thank all the pages that are here this week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too want to recognize some pages from the riding of Yellowknife North that will be assisting us during this sitting. I want to recognize Christopher Matheson, Ellie Maya Taylor, Ramanda Castillo, and Thomas Willoughby. Thank you for your work, and we would be lost without you. Welcome to the House. Thank you.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, me too. I'd like to rise and recognize the language board members that are here and thank them for the work that they do in terms of initiating revitalization projects throughout the NWT. I'd like to especially recognize Jonas Landry, a constituent of mine from Fort Providence, or Tegago Tinquin, and also Sarah Gargan from the Hutlo Deche, but from Hay River. I'd like to welcome them to the House. Merci.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize a former Inuvik resident working here in Yellowknife, Mr. David Bob, as well as Richard Letourneau and Deanna Marie Jacobson, and also take the opportunity to just thank the official board members for all the work, dedication, and passion that you guys have for languages. Massey.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member from Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Karen Mitchell, who is marked down as from Yellowknife, but originally from Fort McPherson. I'd also like to take this time to thank her for all the work that you've done for the Gwich'in language. Masicho.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sorry if I garbled anyone's name earlier. They always give the MLA for Hay River South the easy names. But I failed to mention my constituent, Ms. Myrtle Graham, is with us today, and I'd like to wish her a happy birthday. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we miss anyone in gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Massey. Member statements. Member for Nanakport.
Kuyanani, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the global population grows, the climate changes and the Arctic ecosystems experience unprecedented warming, marine shipping companies have continued to expand operations through the Arctic as a result of increased traffic. One of the concerns that have been raised at the international levels is the prevalent use of heavy fuel oil, or HFO, that fuels marine vessels, as well as a lack of infrastructure in the Arctic, such as deep sea ports, small and medium craft harbors. This is something that needs to be addressed by the Government of Nunavut, the Government of Northwest Territories, the Government of Canada, Inuit and Indigenous people that live in the Arctic, working together to ensure our communities and the people are prepared as traffic increases in Northwest Passage. HFO is dangerous and is several times more polluting than other forms of fuel. For instance, HFO spills are 50 times more toxic to fish than medium and light crude oil spills, and HFO produces higher amounts of black carbon than other fuels, which is the second largest contributor to climate change after CO2. In 2012, more than 75% of the fuel mass of the vessels in the Arctic was composed of HFOs. Recognizing the dangers of HFO, its use has been banned in Antarctica, Mr. Speaker. However, in the Arctic, there are no regulations. The International Maritime Organization, or IMO, is the United Nations agency responsible for the safety and security of shipping and the prevention of marine pollution by ships. As part of its work in developing international shipping related regulation to prevent pollution of marine environments, the use of HFO in the Arctic is currently a topic of concern. This is especially true for Inuit and Indigenous people that live in the Arctic. Mr. Speaker, there are currently no independent organization representing the Arctic Indigenous peoples at the IMO. This means that the Inuit and Indigenous groups who will be most affected by the potential setting of new international policy have no direct say in how Arctic policy is developed. Instead, Indigenous groups must rely on United Nations member states to effect change. Indigenous knowledge plays a fundamental role in Inuit culture. Without adequate representation at the IMO, Inuit voices are not heard and Indigenous knowledge is not considered, leading to potential policies that do not take into consideration the views of will ultimately be most impacted. There currently exists a gap in setting international Arctic policies where Indigenous knowledge of Arctic Indigenous people is not considered. Until a better solution is found, Inuit other Indigenous groups continue to partner with Arctic states to carry our voice as we regulate marine shipping. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and then Member Tunade Willade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to speak about the unfair allocation of capital resources by this government. For 3 terms, Mr. Speaker, I've been asking this government to increase spending in smaller communities. In addition, it is a mandate of this government to create employment where jobs are needed most. All one has to do is examine some NWT statistics to know that our smaller communities where jobs are needed most. Mr. Speaker, over the years, I've asked this government to work with our small communities on a wide variety of community projects and strategic spending items. Some of these include building more access roads around the communities, building a new health center in Klutsalke, building a new school in Deda, all of which would stimulate our economy by creating new jobs and improving services. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, I've asked for a more economically feasible way of allowing seniors to age in place in their homes and in their communities. This could be done by increasing home care services and making seniors' homes barrier-free. Instead, Mr. Speaker, this government is choosing to invest in more expensive models of senior care by building long-term care facilities in Hay River and Nuvik and Yellowknife. Don't get me wrong, Mr. Speaker, I think that these long care facilities will be needed by our government, but for a government that is struggling to increase revenues, it is very apparent that other economic alternatives are needed. Mr. Speaker, there is proven and acceptable economic model that shows that if you put people to work, the government will see returns of at least $2.50 for every dollar that is spent. Mr. Speaker, ministers have told me that this point is true, but the returns were too long-term and the government chooses more often chooses to prioritize short-term returns. Indeed, some of the spending does take time to return results. As an example, in the last 15 years, the percentage of high school graduates have gone up by 35%. Mr. Speaker, investments that produce more immediate returns can be seen in things such as health care costs. It is a fact that a higher individual income means a healthier life. Moreover, other immediate returns can be found through investing in other prevailing social issues such as social housing, mental health and addiction services, which take cost pressures off health care, justice and income support. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Massey. Member seeking unanimous consent to conclude his statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Many of our people either end up homeless or incarcerated due to the high rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, and a chronic lack of employment opportunities. Overall, Mr. Speaker, there are many initiatives that this government can do that can help turn things around and improve the quality of life for the people of the NWT. Marcy Cho, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and then Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've avoided making public comments about the ongoing negotiations between this government and the UNW because I've been under the assumption that both sides are working in good faith towards an agreement. However, I've seen nothing in the past 2.5 years to indicate that a deal will ever be reached. It's beginning to look like a strike is more likely than a timely resolution, so I can't keep quiet any longer. Just look at the centerpiece of the last offer from this government, a 0.1% wage increase over their previous offer. That's the negotiating equivalent of saying, here's a quarter, call someone who cares. Of course, there's more than one party to the negotiations, so it might not be fair to put all the blame on the government. However, I've spoken with a lot of UNW members, and they're more than willing to negotiate. They're aware of the hit that the economy has taken, and they see the struggles that the private sector is facing. So they're not looking to fleece the government. They're just looking for a fair deal, and I know their leadership is aware of that. Regardless, I'm not here to provide oversight of the UNW. I'm here to make sure that this government is working in the best interest of the people, and I don't think that Cabinet's strict adherence to their untenable offer is in the people's best interest. It's clear to everyone that it won't lead to a deal. What the government's position is doing is alienating its employees, putting their backs up against the wall, and making a strike seem like their only recourse. Mr. Speaker, we all know that a strike won't do anyone any good. It won't be good for the public. We already struggle to provide services, and a strike will only make things worse. It won't be good for government employees. They have bills to pay just like everyone else, and not all of them will be able to make those payments on strike pay. It won't be good for the private sector either. Government contracts will dry up, and if people aren't working, they won't be spending money. To be clear, I'm not taking a position on whether the union should strike or not. It's their right to do so if they see fit, and I'm confident they wouldn't do so unless they deem it absolutely necessary. What I am doing is telling Cabinet to get their act together and get back to the negotiating table with a mandate to actually make a deal, a fair deal, so our constituents in the public service don't have this hanging over their head, and so the people of the territory don't pay the price for Cabinet's stubbornness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for most enterprises, it's a drive-through community. The few who stop take advantage of the facilities and essential service provided by the community, such as the gas station. Located at the crossroads of NWT Highways 1 and 2, Enterprise is an important connector to southern Canada. While Enterprise's location on the NWT highway system generates some economic activity for the community, residents are concerned about the safety of pedestrians, especially children, around the community. My constituents have expressed concerns over the fact that in the rush to continue on with the travel, some drivers end up missing signs that are there to protect residents. Mr. Speaker, Enterprise hosts a busy highway intersection. I would like to see the Department of Infrastructure putting up more visible signage to improve the safety of our residents. Simple measures may be enough to make a difference in preventing accidents. I encourage the department staff to reach out to residents to determine how to improve intersections, and I'm available to assess as well. I'll have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure at a later time. Massey, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I want to speak today on a subject that often goes unnoticed but deserves to be addressed immediately, and that is child marriage. It is estimated that each year 15 million girls around the world are married before the age of 18. In September 2013, the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario released a report that counted 219 confirmed or suspected cases of forced marriage in Ontario and Quebec from 2010 to 2011. These problems are not far away but very close to home. Marriage laws vary among provinces and territories, with a legal age of marriage generally set at 18. However, in many provinces, a person with consent from both parents can be married at age 16 or 17. We are one of those jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker, and that needs to change. In 2017, this government updated the Marriage Act. Prior to the update, a minor actually could be married under the age of 15 in the Northwest Territories, as long as they got a special dispensation from the Minister of Health and Social Services, which would only be handed out if the female party was pregnant. Also, according to the prior version of the Act, consent was not necessary from the minor, only from the parents. To say this version of the Act was in major need of an update would be putting it lightly, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, though, after reviewing the updated version of the Act, there's still a section of the legislation specifically there to allow minors to marry, Section 16. This section stipulates that minors can be married under the age of majority as long as they have personally consented, their parents or guardians have consented, and they have proper documentation like a birth certificate or statutory declaration to prove their age. I must state I am confounded as to why the department felt we still need to have Section 16 of the Marriage Act as part of the updated 2017 version. You cannot vote until you're 18, you cannot buy alcohol until 19, and generally you cannot sign a legally binding contract until you're 19 as well. But you can enter into a marriage at 16 in the Northwest Territories. This seems a very antiquated part of the Act that really needs to change, Mr. Speaker. It's 2018, and child marriages should be relegated to the distant memory of our past. Governments have a responsibility to ensure safety and security of minors, and to have updated our Act so recently and not remove Section 16 was at very least an unfortunate occurrence that could cost a minor dearly in the future. I urge the government to remove Section 16 of the Marriage Act entirely, and I'll have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services later on today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recent news highlighted GNWT partners with Royal Military College of Canada on engineering projects. Mr. Speaker, engineering services are the most needed proponent of any construction team. Advancing forward, I foresee a beneficial partnership. Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories covers 13.5% of Canada and attributes to 1.3 million square kilometers, a vast area covering and amounts to virtually a large amount of untapped resources and communities' cost of living reductions by road connections to the rest of Canada. Mr. Speaker, given the high demand for infrastructure projects, like all-season roads, one budgetary aspect for project engineering is usually estimated between 10 and 15%. Mr. Speaker, given this innovation for project cost savings, I'm grateful for the potential SAW2 projects by the Department of Infrastructure's initiative to engage and structure a collaboration arrangement between our government and the Royal Military College of Canada for the supply of project engineering services. Mr. Speaker, this preparatory arrangement gives me confidence steps are underway to utilize this idle time while we await the decisions by our federal counterparts for the applications submitted by our government last November, in particular the MVH or Mackenzie Valley Highway. Mr. Speaker, this is truly a proactive measure. We have potentially northern projects and engineering students that eagerly looking forward to meeting the challenges of designing infrastructure underneath northern conditions, including climate change elements. In project theory, the more administrative savings, the more project embankment we can see realized. Later, Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the appropriate minister. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I gave a statement on the real impacts of the cost of living. Some people suggested I should be more positive and upbeat in my messages. Well, I want that person to know that his point did not fall on deaf ears, and today I am happy to commend the Department of Infrastructure for the ongoing progress made on the Ingram Trail. Mr. Speaker, roads are the most cost-effective way to bridge the distances that separate residents from their extended families, lands, and resources. That's why the biggest items on our infrastructure to-do list are highways. They're important for mines and jobs, for tourism, and for the people and families. The Ingram Trail started off as a dusty old mining trail, but now it's a successful multi-use highway. In the past, it supported our gold mines. Now it resupplies our diamond industry. And it's crucial to the exploration that will generate our future prosperity. It is the beginning of the road to the Slave Geological Province, after all. Beyond that, the trail supports important recreational and economic activities. It supports economic diversification, tourism, and access for visitors to the spectacular NWT. It supports some of our agricultural pioneers and commercial enterprises. The trail has parks and campgrounds and hiking trails everywhere. And Mr. Speaker, the trail is home to many full-time residents. So I commend the department for its many improvements to the safety and usability of the road. New guardrails, widened sections and shoulders, extension of paved surfaces are important additions. The reconfiguration and growth of the Prosperous Boat Launch in particular is a great contribution to accessibility and safety. The responses I've heard from users and constituents living on the trail all commend and appreciate these improvements. There are still some challenges we will have to confront in the coming months and years. How will maintenance needs change as climate warms? How will traffic flow be changed by new resource developments? How will increasing numbers of tourists sharing the road with residents and diamond mines resupply change safety, traffic, and enforcement requirements? These and other questions will need our continued attention. Mr. Speaker, most important, the Ingram Trail is an example of a successful multi-purpose transportation corridor that serves not just one, but many of the NWT's economic and social needs. We can use it as a model for our territory's future growth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'm going to continue providing my version of the mandate letters that should have been given to the ministers who took on new portfolios in April. As I said yesterday, the Premier's mandate letters repeat letters he provided to prior ministers. It's as if nothing has happened in the last 2 years. There is no indication of priorities, just a long list of objectives. So let me try and fix that, this time with the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. First, childcare. Childcare is the second largest expense for most families in Yellowknife, and not only in Yellowknife, who have children under 4 and/or have children who need care after school, on the innumerable teacher education days, and during the summer. It is a priority of the 18th Assembly to make childcare both more accessible and more affordable, and the mandate letter acknowledges this point. The 3-year plan negotiated by the previous minister will provide for professional development for staff and access to childcare in more places, but there isn't one word about affordability. Mr. Speaker, the new minister needs to reconcile these competing visions of the future of childcare in the NWT to ensure that it is both accessible and affordable. Second, Aurora College. The college has faced significant uncertainty and disruption for more than a year, following the previous minister's decision to suspend the social work and teacher education programs and to dismiss the board. Resolving these issues and others have been put on hold pending the completion of the foundational review. Now that it is complete, I eagerly await the public discussion of the results of the foundational review and the department's vision for the college's future, as well as the future of post-secondary education in the NWT. Third, income support. I receive many calls from constituents who have issues with service delivery. For example, I have a constituent who has been trying to sort out payment of childcare expenses in order to attend Aurora College. The issue has been unresolved for more than 6 months. I appreciate that IA staff have rules to follow, but a few take a punitive approach to clients who have no other choice but to apply for help. Mr. Speaker, there is no reason to further diminish their dignity on purpose. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Education, Culture and Employment is large and diverse. I could have chosen another half-dozen issues to talk about today. What I am looking forward to is the Minister's own vision for her new role. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Ike Godin, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk housing in the NWT, or lack of housing. Mr. Speaker, as it stands right now, housing is a major issue in our communities. There are families that have been on the waiting list for months, and in some cases for years. Fort McPherson has had the same concerns with housing. Just not enough units available for families that are growing, and not enough units for single adults. We have new families that are just beginning their lives together with little or no housing available. Mr. Speaker, in all our communities we have homelessness. People who are couch surfing because they have no home. Fortunately, we have large extended families that will take in family members on short-term basis. The elders in Fort McPherson have been put on hold once again in terms of getting their new elders home built. In 2015, after a few years of designing the building, selecting a site for the building, trucking all the materials to Fort McPherson, finally construction began on the new elders home. Mr. Speaker, The building barely got off the ground. The project was undergoing some problems of management. This was nothing to do with the elders who are excitedly waiting to see who is going to be residing in the new units. The project was stopped and left unattended for months and months. In early 2017, negotiations took place, and once again, the project was in full swing. Employment was up, people were busy, and everyone was happy. Now, just recently, the project has been put on hold, and everyone is questioning what's going on, and when will the construction start again? And what about our elders? Mr. Speaker, we need to complete this building as soon as possible, and I'll have questions later today. Thank you.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goodden and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. It seems that we have a roads theme day here today. My message is going to be a little bit different. This April, the federal government denied GNWT's funding application for its National Trade Corridor Fund towards the construction of the Slade Geological Province Road. This is the proposal to turn the current winter road to the diamond mines into an all-weather corridor and join it with the proposed Grays Bay Road and Port project to Nunavut's Arctic coast. Nunavut's proposal for the Grays Bay Road and Port project was similarly denied, and the Nunavut government quickly pulled out of that project on April the 14th. And then the Kitikmeot Inuit Association requested that the environmental review of it be suspended on May 2nd, a request which was accepted 2 days later. Now that this project has been shelved indefinitely, it's time that our government did the same thing with the Slade Geological Province Road and focus on other infrastructure. A business case has yet to be completed, and there has been no independent analysis of the costs and benefits of the Slade Geological Province Road. Quite simply, our government doesn't have the fiscal capacity to build this $540 million road with our limited borrowing capacity, even if the federal government was to make a substantial contribution. Our government should stop raising unrealistic expectations that this project can be started within the mandate of the 18th Assembly. On the environmental side, there is no approved range plan, management plan, or recovery strategy for the Bathurst caribou herd or a legally binding land use plan for this region. No additional funds to implement any of these initiatives were included in the 2018-19 main estimates. Until this work is completed, funded, and implemented, with a documented rebound in the health of the Bathurst caribou herd, an all-weather road into the Slade Geological Province, especially a publicly funded road, would not be in the public interest. If we want caribou and the food security, tourism, and other ecological and cultural benefits caribou bring, we cannot have an all-weather road into the heart of their range. I will have questions later today on why Cabinet continues to pursue the Slade Geological Province Road when there is no economic case for it, no fiscal capacity to build it, and no plan to protect caribou. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Must see. Member statement. Member Ike Goodden and the member Nehende.
Mr. Speaker. Al Browning came into this world like a sheep on July 10, 1963, and departed like a lion on March 19, 2018. Much too soon for all of us to comprehend or believe. He has left a great void in the lives of those who loved him deeply. Alan is the second oldest child of Rosie and Tommy Browning. He is a descendant of the great family who has a rich history around Fort Simpson in the Deschaux. The Browning family is part of the northern history, and his grandfather ran a sawmill that provided much of the lumber for the community's early infrastructure. Alan and his great members of his family will forever be remembered for their contribution to the growth of this community, the region, and the north. Alan was a caring and loving man who truly cared for the people he loved, especially his family. He did not say it, he proved it in many ways. Just prior to his sudden departure, he visited his parents' resting place and prayed by their gravesite. He did the same for his sister's gravesite. It brings great comfort to know that he's united with his parents and his loving big sister, the beautiful and courageous Yvonne. Alan has a strong presence in his nieces and nephews, especially Tiffany. He made sure that he was there for all special moments. He was a special uncle who enjoyed being part of her celebration and achievements. As well, he loved his brother Foster with all his heart and supported him. Alan attended Acacia Hall and formerly He formed long-life friendships with many people from all over the NWT and Nunavut. When people from the past bumped into him, he always remembered them and made them laugh. Through good and bad times, he made people look at the good. That was one of his many gifts as a friend. Alan worked as a recreation director in numerous communities, and as a result, many knew many people and friends wherever he went. Some of the youth he inspired are now adults and families and fondly remember his passion, inspiration, and continue to bring this to their children and others to this day. Mr. Speaker, in closing, Alan's true love was Angela Kulaktana, who he met during his school years. As fate would have it, they connected later in life and did not miss a beat. They loved each other deeply, and they were together. When they were together, there was a twinkle in their eye. He will be sadly missed by all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Our condolences to the family as well. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mussey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to return to item 5, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Mussey.
Member seeking unanimous consent to return to item number 5, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may continue.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. David Bob. He recently relocated to Yellowknife from Inuvik, where he's taken the position of President of the Northern Territories Federation of Labour, and he's wisely chosen to live in my constituency. Mussey.
Mussey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Acknowledgements. Member for Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize Ted Grant, owner of Fort Simpson Air. In the fall of 2017, he received this Senator's Sequential Centennial Medal. Ted volunteered his time with coaching hockey and generously donated to kids' sports teams in the community. He's also showed his dedication by promoting tourism to the Nahanni Park. Ted has been a long-time resident of Fort Simpson, dating back to his days as an RCMP officer in the community in 1970. His favorite thing about Fort Simpson is that he does not have to live in the city where everything is hectic, and in Fort Simpson it's quiet and the scenery is beautiful. He likes how everyone knows everyone and is willing to help those around him. Congratulations, Ted, and thank you for everything you do in our community. Thank you.
Mussey. Acknowledgements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge my constituent Eric Bussey, who recently received the National Emergency Management Exemplary Service Award. Mr. Bussey was the Senior Emergency Management Official for the GNWT for 25 years, including 15 years for Nunavut prior to division. He expanded participation in the Territorial Emergency Response Committee and helped create the Civil Air Search and Rescue Association, or CASERA, and the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary. He led the development of highway emergency alerting protocols and brought northern EMO issues to national forums. Please join me in saluting his career of service. Mussey.
Mussey. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Nunavut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier I spoke about Inuit and Indigenous peoples' participation in development of Arctic policies. My questions are for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, my first question to the Premier is, what is the Premier doing to ensure that Arctic Indigenous peoples' priorities are brought to the forefront when engaging with the federal government? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government of Northwest Territories has advocated for the inclusion of Northwest Territories Indigenous governments, including the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, and work around the Arctic Policy Framework. At the Intergovernmental Council meeting in December 2017, I agreed that the Government of Northwest Territories would work collaboratively with Indigenous governments to develop a northern approach to the framework, including the Northwest Territories chapter. Government of Northwest Territories officials held a roundtable discussion with Indigenous governments in January 2018 to get initial thoughts on the Arctic Policy Framework and what should go into a Northwest Territories chapter. We have also received written submissions and continue to meet with Indigenous governments. When it comes to Arctic marine shipping and other Arctic policies, we are not involved significantly as a subnational government. The federal government guards their responsibilities very seriously, and we have minimal input into those Arctic marine policy framework. And I should add that Arctic Indigenous peoples have more representation in international venues such as the Arctic Council, where they're permanent participants, than our own government does. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akita Kasi, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. It's good to see that the Premier and the GNWT is looking at all Indigenous groups that live across, not just in NWT, but looking at the relevance and the issues and concerns from other regions. Mr. Speaker, my second question is, what has the GNWT's involvement been on the development of the Arctic Policy Framework? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government of Northwest Territories is currently co-chairing the Provincial Territorial Officials Working Group of the Arctic Policy Framework. Drafting is underway for the front end of the Arctic Policy Framework and is being shared with Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories, including the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade Kasi, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Premier for that. Mr. Speaker, my final question for the Premier, when we talk about Indigenous peoples, we talk about Indigenous knowledge and everything like that as well. Language was here as well. Mr. Speaker, how has the GNWT ensured that Indigenous knowledge is considered in the development of the Arctic Policy Framework? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, a priority identified by the Northwest Territories Indigenous governments at the roundtable session in 2018 was the importance of the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the Arctic Policy Framework. That priority has been shared with Canada, and we advocate for language that emphasizes the importance of Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous governments and organizations across the North have also been vocal about the need for language around Indigenous knowledge during the roundtable sessions held by Canada. And I should add that Inuit Tapirisat Kanatami has the advantage of they have their own chapter. They also can have input into Newfoundland and Labrador chapter, in the Northwest Territories chapter, and also the Nunavut chapter if they seek to do so. Thank you very much, Mr.
Masi. Oral question. The member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. In my statement, I addressed 3 of my priorities. I'd now like to hear what her priorities are for the next 18 months. Masi.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd first like to start with saying I found it very interesting that the MLA actually expressed her mandates for education, culture, and employment, because in my personal opinion, we need more women in leadership, and we need to have, nothing against our Premier, I love our Premier, but wouldn't it be wonderful to see a woman Premier that could actually give mandates out to departments? So I'd like to start with that. What are my mandates? So, of course, I do have to listen to our Premier, because I do respect him and I like the man very much. So he's actually given me a direction that I have to abide by. I also recognize that I have to abide by the mandate commitments that were made at the beginning of this Assembly by all of us together. Personally, what I want to do on top of that, recognizing yesterday, too, that a really wise statement was said that when there's too many priorities, you have no priority. I took heed to that last night and I thought about that, because that is true. However, I'm a workaholic and I'm going to move forward. So what I'd like to see done, besides the mandates from the Premier, the mandates from the House, is I think we need to focus on in early childhood development. We need to, one of the mandates is getting daycares into the communities. We have problems with dropouts. We have problems with kids getting into schools. So I'd like to see a daycare like a school that becomes a hub for a community. And so I've already given direction to look at a pilot with that. So if I can, the basic would be putting a daycare into a community setting. The ideal would be putting a child development center into a school setting. So that's one thing I'm working on. We need to look at our JK to 12 actually. We have children that are dropping out. So we need to look at what's going on. So I'm a big supporter of the Pathways program. I'm liking that we're going to be strengthening it to actually work with younger children so that we give them the choices and the options when they finish school. And we talk to them about the skills they will need in the courses, the curriculum that they will need to be able to succeed in their future. Post-secondary, definitely. It's been on the table for not only this assembly, many assemblies. We need to make sure that not only our post-secondary, that every education support we have is based on best practices, that we look at making sure that we do cross-jurisdictional, we have measurable outcomes, we have evaluations in place. So that's a priority for me. Languages, absolutely need to do that. I was honored to have the language officials here today because we need to strengthen them. And income security. We need to look at that productive choice things. We need to look at self-employment in small communities, and if I can move that into productive choice, because we have, in small communities, we have no employment. So let's see if we can look at self-employment options in our productive choices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, I see more of a written question coming up after that. Oral question, Akita Cassie, member, Young Life Center.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's sincere efforts to answer my questions, and I'm really pleased that there is some overlap in our concerns. I want to look at childcare. I heard her say she's got a pilot project. That's all well and good, but the mandate calls for not only accessible childcare, but affordable childcare. So how is the Minister going to make childcare more affordable? Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I took the position, the new position, actually the previous minister was working diligently at that. There were increases to the daycare providers, licensed daycare homes that were provided, a large increase for infants, a smaller increase for the older ages up to 3, and then a small, but still an increase for the after-school children. The junior kindergarten also is huge for parents. I had my own concerns about it when it was going through, and I'm happy to say that those concerns have been alleviated. Parents are saying it's working, they're saving money. So affordability is being addressed. We gave increases, junior kindergarten, a lot of parents are excited. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadode Cassie, member, Young Life Center.
Mr. Speaker, I look forward to discussing the Aurora College Foundational Review. I wonder if the Minister can give us a sense of how and when that's going to happen in public. Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Aurora College Foundational Review is one piece of the puzzle. The big thing is our post-secondary education. This is not something that should become political and he said, she said, what are you going to do about it? This is our future. This is critical. So I have made a commitment, and I would like to say, if I'm allowed, I might get slapped on the hand after, but the chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development is on board as well. We need to work as a whole of government on this one. So I am not going to be the minister to stand up and say, this is what I'm doing. I am going to be the minister that says, let's work together to make sure that this is the best post-secondary options for our youth, for our future, for our grandchildren, and many to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member, Young Life Center.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask that question again because I didn't hear an answer in it. What I asked specifically about the review is if the Minister could give us a sense of how and when we're going to discuss that document. Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. The member is correct. I should have been a little bit more blunt. I'm excited about the possibilities. The document, the Aurora College Foundational Report, will be tabled next week, and we already in the process. So it will become public next week, and we're already in the process of working with the committee, standing committee, on the review and how we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Or question he could carry the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during the last budget process, we talked about the new positions called Children and Youth Council position, and we're very excited about it. And however, there seems to be some confusions about persons' qualifications. Can the minister briefly describe what qualifications these positions need to do the job? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the qualifications for the child and youth care counsellors and clinical supervisors are an extension of the current structure of the community counselling program, where the knowledge, skills, and abilities, which are really the key to the job, are typically acquired through a master's levels education. This has been the case from the early stages of this current initiative. We have taken timely action to actively recruit for these positions. Information packages have been sent to post-secondary institutions with applicable programs, as well as NWT students enrolled in those programs. I'm pleased to report that these efforts have already resulted in a high level of interest from individuals enrolled in master's programs from across the country, including individuals from the north who are excited at the possibility of returning to provide these new services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. And it's great to hear all these things, good things are happening. But can he please explain how they come up for the requirements of having a master's degrees for these positions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Child and Youth Counsellor Initiative was developed at a table of interdepartmental child and youth mental wellness action planning working group, a group put together to help us lead this initiative. The work of this group was guided by the feedback of NWT youth, who expressed that they wanted access to specialized mental health supports to assist them in the very serious and very complex challenges they are facing. In addition, they spoke clearly and strongly about the challenges of living in small communities and feeling apprehensive about accessing services because of the perceived lack of privacy and confidentiality. The youth also spoke of the need to have professionals to talk to who are not necessarily related to them and or friends or partners of their families. The job descriptions of the counselors have been drafted on the needs expressed by the youth during these discussions. The qualifications for the positions are based on the requirements of the job and the professional knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to fulfill those requirements. Following GNWT protocols for drafting job descriptions, it has been determined that a master's level education in counseling related fields such as clinical social work or psychology or educational psychology or even art therapy and other related jobs is a typical way of an incumbent entering the field in today's market. As such, in our job descriptions, we identify the knowledge, skills, and ability, which is the key, as well as how these skills are typically acquired, which, if you're entering the field today, is often through master's preparation. Thank you.
Oral question, Tada member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. When looking at the requirements of all these positions needing master's social work degree, that's a huge. We're looking at 49 positions, so that has a huge impact on it. It also has caused a huge issue for staff presently in these counseling positions who have years of experience, know the youth, but they don't have a master's degrees. And then I'm hearing rumors through the grapevine that, that they're not even going to be looking at these positions here. So can the minister ensure that these people are getting a fair opportunity to do the job? I'm not asking them to give the job, but I want to give the fair opportunity to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I truly appreciate the members' concerns as well as the concerns of some of the staff out there. The department was taking action to actively recruit for these positions, as I've previously indicated. I anticipate that the positions will be posted in the very near future and hopeful that we will receive applicants from many qualified individuals. And while, Mr. Speaker, while a master's level of education is identified within the job description, as is the case with all GNWT competitions, equivalencies will absolutely be considered A master's degree is one way that an individual may develop the knowledge, skills, and ability as outlined in the job description. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we are looking for individuals with the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to provide the high-quality counselling services that the youth are demanding. Decisions will be made on competencies to perform the job, not just the educational qualifications that typically lead to these knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we will be working with our current employees, and where appropriate, they will have opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. No dere kasi member na hindi.
I thank the minister for that answer, because we can reassure our staff out there and the people that are doing a great job. I mean, I know in my writing and my colleagues' writing from the DHO, we have two really good people out there that are doing a great job and doing really good work with our youth, and so I appreciate that. Can the minister explain, though, we have a master's degree for both the supervisor and the counselor's position, so what's the difference? Because I would have assumed that, you know, you'd have a social work degree and then you'd have the master's degree actually supervising that. So can the minister explain what the different roles are with these two positions and qualifications? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, clinical supervisors are also professional counselors, requiring the same level of knowledge, skills, and abilities typically acquired through a master's level education, as I've previously indicated, similar to the counselors. However, they are also typically senior counselors who, in addition to their counseling education and experience, have often undertaken additional training in management or supervisory areas that allow them to have the knowledge, skills, and ability to provide that supervisory responsibility and or leadership responsibility. So yes, they both need to have the masters, typically have the masters in counseling, but they also need additional skills in order to provide that supervisory and management responsibility. So it's the same plus, if you will. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Hikada Canyon, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member's statement. I have a few questions for the minister responsible for Housing Corporation. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister, what were the reasons for the recent halt of work to the elders' home in Fort McPherson? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of NWT Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's part of it's the building seasons that we have to do work up in the high Arctic. There was also some discovered structural design issues with that, and we had to do a new design, get a new consultant to develop a design, and then get that to us at the Housing Corp. Thank you.
Oral question. Akira Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know this is a serious issue, but it's kind of funny because these issues were identified during the negotiations of the new contractors, and I'm glad that the department woke up and smelt the coffee and realized that this work needed to be done. So I'd like to ask the minister, when can we see construction starting up again for the summer months? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of NWT Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the NWT Housing Corp is going to be meeting with the current contractor as well as the structural engineers to look at the redesign. And as soon as the ferry opens and road opens, we'll start working on that building again. Thank you.
Tada Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know this put a little delay in construction, but I'd like to ask the minister, are we still on target to complete the elders' home for the fall? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of NWT Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we're still on target for this fall. Thank you.
Oral question. Hikada Canyon, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I lost cabinet with my earlier statement, so I'll try and get him back with a compliment here. The Department of Infrastructure, at least the transportation portion of it, does a pretty good job of informing the public and stakeholders of fee increases. And they've had a lot of practice lately, so I'm sure they're getting better day by day. Maybe I lost him again. The Department of Lands hasn't been around as long as transportation, and maybe that's why they're not quite as adept as transportation at getting that type of information out. The recent changes to the cost of territorial land is one example where there could have been better communication, and that's received quite a bit of attention as of late. Another example is a doubling of quarrying fees that occurred on April 1st, 2018. I did some research and I found that the increase was mentioned in the House by the Minister once in early 2017 and once in early 2016. But beyond that, it wasn't conveyed to the public in any meaningful way. So when a business is bidding on a job that uses materials from quarries, it needs to know what its costs are. And as a result of this change, some small businesses are out thousands of dollars. So now what's done is done, but I'm sure the Department of Lands will increase fees again in the coming years. And so my hope here is that we can improve their communication process to avoid these types of incidents in the future. So first, I'd like to ask the Minister of Lands if he could explain how this 100% increase in quarrying royalties were conveyed to the public and to stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Nice statement.
Massey. Minister of Lands.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is important that we do communicate with the public as well as MLAs. There are several processes that we follow, which were also followed with respect to the changes in the proposed change, or the actual changes now in the lease fees. In this case, with respect to the specific question, the department in late 2016 engaged SCOP with our intent and duty to consult Indigenous governments on the proposed fee changes. This consultation included changes to fees for administrative services, quarry royalties, and lease rent minimums. This was followed up November 2016 with consultation letters to IGOs to inform of the department's intent to change fees and royalties, as well as to hear any impacts that the proposed changes may have to their organizations. The NWT Chamber of Mines engaged the department in February 2017, specifically on the subject of the granular resource fee increases. There was concern with respect to the proposed change and impacts on the mining sector. Department officials advised the Chamber that their concerns were noted and that there would be a pre-gazetting period when written submissions could be submitted. So we followed a similar process with respect to the changes in lease fees. So there has been consultation, therefore, with the IGOs, and there also has been direct communication with the mining industry through the Chamber of Mines. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Or a question. Nakita Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so the minister stated that they brought the information to the Standing Committee on Priorities and Planning in 2016, and they consulted with Indigenous governments, and the Chamber of Mines actually approached them regarding these fees. That's in contrast to the Department of Transportation, or now Infrastructure, which will put on Facebook and Twitter and the radio that there are changes to the fees to cross the Daitro Bridge for commercial vehicles. And so that's the type of communication that I'd like to see coming out of Lands to avoid these types of issues that I've been talking about. So will the minister commit to reviewing their communication policy and updating it so it's something similar to what Infrastructure does? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Yes. Certainly, Infrastructure has set a very high standard, and I would be prepared to look at their processes and see if they are applicable to our situation. Clearly, we want to communicate with the public when there are changes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or a question. Nikita County, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I spoke positively about the Ingram Trail. And so my questions today are for the Minister of Infrastructure. I have a few questions relevant to some of the maintenance issues with regard to the road. First of all, we still have a section of the road here that has been maybe somewhat forgotten, and it goes from the turnoff at Highway 3 out to the old Giant Mine town site. It's still used quite irregularly by those that use the boat dock there and go to the Mine Heritage exhibit, as well as the city solid waste management facility and the skiing lodge. And so I'd like to ask the minister if he's been down that road recently and seen the conditions of that road. It is really pitted with potholes, and I'm just wondering what the maintenance schedule will be for that section of road for this coming year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I have traveled that road as of a couple nights ago with Member McNeely when we were out having a look around town, and there is a number of potholes on that section of highway. I suspect that the maintenance crews that will be looking after and maintaining all highways across with Northwest Territories, as all members know, we got to wait till the road thaws out and get on these situations. I believe this section of highway is ours at this point. I think we're having discussions with the City of Yellowknife and taking over that section of highway, and we can keep the members abreast on that, but I will look into what the maintenance schedule is fixing these potholes on that section of highway. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or a question. Nakita, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that commitment. I look forward to him getting back to me so that I can inform constituents. The department has done some really good work recently with regard to visibility on the Ingram Trail. They've done significant brush clearing. However, this brush clearing has raised some concerns with residents and other users. I'm wondering if the minister can maybe indicate to us what process it was that they undertook to do the brush clearing. Maybe would there be improvements in the future? Specifically, could maybe residents or others get access to some of the wood that was cut during the brush cutting so that it could be utilized in wood stoves and for other means possibly? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of the brush cutting that took place out there recently, but I can certainly have a look into it. And if there's an opportunity for residents along the Ingram Trail to access some of that wood, we'll certainly consider that, and I will get back to the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or a question. Tada, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks again to the Minister for that commitment. Appreciate him looking into that and look forward to getting his feedback. Thirdly, I've been asking for a couple years now to make an investment with regard to some guardrails in a couple sections of road that still appear to be unsafe as it relates to the steepness of the road going into sharp corners. I won't reiterate where they are. The minister knows what I'm referring to. I'd just like to ask the minister what the update would be in terms of the work being done for those guardrails. Are they expected to come this construction season? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, we replaced 3 guardrails at kilometer 33.8, 37.6, and 45.5. And the department has here in my note that we're doing a planning and survey and design work is underway for possible installation of guardrails at kilometer 13.5 and kilometer 18.7 for the 2018-19 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Or a question. Nundida, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that I think that it's in the main estimates that we are making this commitment to these guardrails, is my understanding. But I'll take possible as a soft commitment from the minister for now, but I will certainly keep on him. Lastly, I did take a drive out on the road recently, all the way to the end, and in fact the paving of the road is almost done. It is already up to Cameron River, I believe. I would like to ask the minister what other funds and investments are going to be made for the remainder of the Ingram Trail, or can we look forward to it being completed up to Tibbet Lake possibly in the next year or two? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For members that aren't aware, on Bundle 1 from the BCIP money, we spent $8 million roughly on the Ingram Trail. But I'm glad to say that on Bundle 3, the approval that we had from the federal government here recently, we will have an additional $10 million that we will be able to spend on Ingram Trail between 2019 to 2024. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. While we're on the subject of roads, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure on the who's the proponent for the Slave Geological Province Road. A business case for the project has not been completed. There's no independent cost-benefit analysis either, and the federal government has denied funding in our most recent application. Can the minister tell us what is the status of this project? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member stated, we were denied funding on the first round of the National Trades and Corridor Fund. One thing I want to make light of that is there was over 300 applicants right across this country for this funding, and a $2 billion fund, which I've always said at the FPT tables, we could spend the whole $2 billion. So we're competing against all of Canada for a small pot of money. That's not saying our project is any more or less desirable than any other one, just that there's a limited amount of funding. We believe there's a second round of funding for this pot of money coming out this fall, and it'll be specific to the 3 northern corridors, the carve-out of the $400 million, and we will be resubmitting our application to that when that call comes out. But we believe that our application will have a very positive chance of being accepted through that process on the second round. The other thing that I think that we need to be well aware of, that we have the opportunity now, I don't know if all the members seen it, as of yesterday, they've appointed a CEO to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, and this project has a revenue generating potential, and we believe that it has a good fit in the Infrastructure Bank, and we will continue to pursue those opportunities as things move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question à Kidder, Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. Earlier today, I questioned our government's fiscal capacity to take on this $540 million project. So, given our limited borrowing, given our borrowing limit, competing infrastructure priorities, what evidence can the Minister provide that our government has the fiscal capacity to initiate the SGP road within the term of the 18th Assembly? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, it's very unlikely the construction of the Slave Geological Province would happen in the life of this Assembly. The project is dependent on, as I've said, securing federal funding. It also needs to have fully considered the social and economic impacts through an appropriate environmental impact review and permitting process. We know that's going to be a very lengthy process, and we will take advantage of funding opportunities that become available to us. As I've said, in the second round, we will submit our application. With that said, though, the government's Northwest Territories borrowing limit would have to be increased and for our fiscal capacity to be able to do the Slave Geological Province, and I believe that the Minister of Finance has initiated some initial discussions around that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada, Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that new information. Earlier today, I referred to the incomplete and unfunded work on the Bathurst Caribou herd, and that there's no land use plan for this region. As a lead minister on this project, can the Minister explain to the public how Cabinet applies the land use sustainability framework to the Slave Geological Province Road? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As most members know, this Slave Geological Province Access Corridor is currently in the very early planning stages. The application of the Land Use Sustainability Framework will be the key next step to advancing and planning of this project once federal funding has been secured. As we move forward, we know that we have to have considerations for land use, protection of wildlife, economic opportunities for this project, and we will provide the involvement of Indigenous organizations in ongoing development of this project as we move forward on it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere, Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that, and I might be able to help him with that next step. With my next question here, I mentioned that the government of Nunavut and even the Kitikmeot Inuit Association have stopped work on the Grays Bay Road and Port project so they can cut their losses short. When will our government cut our losses short and stop the use of public funds for the Slave Geological Province Road? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that said, we know the Kitikmeot organization is still very interested. There's been some discussion going on how they want to participate and support not only their road but ours. So I wouldn't say that it's totally dead on that side of it. We know that the Government of Northwest Territories has identified the Slave Geological Province in our mandate. We're all well aware of that, and around our 25-year transportation strategy, we heard from Northerners that this is a high priority. Most members agree with me that this is a key to the future of our territory around economic development and support residents to adapt to impacts of climate change, to help create economic growth and prosperity for residents of the Northwest Territories and Indigenous governments, and we're committed to making this project a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to follow up with my statement and ask some questions to the Minister of Infrastructure. But before I do that, just wanted to highlight some things. Humboldt, Saskatchewan. I think everybody is aware of the tragedy that transpired over in the recent course of recent months. And in the community of Enterprise, there's an intersection that runs through the community. There's a lot of traffic that goes through there, and we have a Lumen industry, the rural wood pellets. Once it gets into operation, we'll probably see a lot of traffic go through there. So safety concerns have been raised by the community in terms of how it is that traffic goes through their community. At the same time, there was a letter sent to the department, and on the May 7th meeting, it was very loud and clear that there's ongoing concerns. And so, and I understand that the department was supposed to assess some of the steps that could be taken. So my question is to the Minister of Infrastructure. What action is the Minister of Infrastructure taking to address the safety concerns of the intersection with the local residents of Enterprise? Merci.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess let's start with what we've done previously already. We've lowered the speed zone through that area. Every time there's an accident at any place on the highway of the NWT system, we review it with the RCMP and take steps that need to help mitigate that. Safety barriers and guardrails were also installed a couple of years ago along the riverbank system there, along the Enterprise intersection. But as of the meeting that we had during the Decho tour with Michael Natalie, we gave the letter to the Mayor of Enterprise stating that we will be sending our staff in there to do a review of their concerns and meet with the local authorities to discuss their concerns going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to thank the Minister for his reply and plus his attendance at a recent Decho tour of the Decho riding. In the letter to the Department of Infrastructure, the Hamlet of Enterprise recommends the installation of rumbler strips at the intersection. What is the Minister doing to address this recommendation by local residents? Merci.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, in their letter to me, they've mentioned rumble strips, lower speed limits, signage, pedestrian crossing, and like I said at the time of the meeting there when we were doing the Decho tour, that I would send our staff in there to do an assessment and meet with the community and then make an assessment and get back to me, and we can discuss that with the community and the member from the riding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think what we all could sense is that there needs to be some action taken. So when can the residents of Enterprise expect or see safety improvements to the intersection that runs through the community of Enterprise? Merci.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, I've directed our staff to go in there and meet with the community and do an assessment. Once that assessment is complete in consultation with the residents, whatever recommendations come out of that going forward, I can keep the member abreast of the timelines when improvements will be made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister commit to a specific date that he will have his staff meet with the community leadership so that at least they can get a heads up and ensure that they're prepared for the meeting? Merci.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I will check with the department and see what the planning was around the date that we want to meet with the community. I know summer's coming and a number of the members riding people on council may be on holiday, so we have to get that date straightened out, and I'll let them know the exact date when we want to go in there sooner than better, hopefully. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Yikara Cannon, the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier today I spoke about the issue of underage marriage of minors in the Northwest Territories. I know the department reviewed this legislation in 2017, and I know they do a very thorough job when they do these legislative reviews. So can the Minister of Health and Social Services advise as to why Section 16 of the Act, which permits marriage of those age 16, why that wasn't removed? What was the justification at the time to retain that section of the Act? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous act was actually replaced and repealed and replaced during the life of this Assembly. We did have an opportunity to bring that bill before committee and also before this House, where it received unanimous support from all members in the passage of that bill. The bill brings us in line with the Federal Civil Marriages Act. It removed the ability for minors and people younger to get married. With minors, there's the exception where they do get consent from their legal guardians. We did have debate on this bill in the House, and I have reviewed Open NWT's Hansard earlier today when the member brought it up, and I did not see any indication that the member had raised this concern during the debate of that bill. And I do recognize that the member was one of the 18 members who unanimously supported that bill at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Nakira Cassie member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do not serve in the standing committee that reviewed the bill, and I'm not aware if this section of the Act was actually within the scope of the bill that the department was proposing. But I certainly did support the changes that brought the Act in line with the Federal Civil Marriages Act. And I apologize for going on at length, but regardless of what happened then, this is still an issue. Is it something the minister is concerned about, or is this not a problem that is worth addressing? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just as a note, just so we're clear, the bill was discussed in committee of the whole clause by clause and did receive unanimous consent in this Assembly from all members. As per our normal process, the bill did go to committee, who had an opportunity to do a thorough review of the bill. We did get a letter from committee expressing some questions around this particular issue. The issue is the ability of a minor to marry. The legislation requires that if a minor does desire to get married, they must still obtain a marriage license. To obtain a marriage license, they must get consent from their legal guardians. If their legal guardians are not present or do not exist, they do have the ability to get an order from the Supreme Court that would allow them to move forward with the acquisition of a marriage license. Regardless, issuers are required to communicate with potential applicants to ensure that they understand the nature of the marriage license, the nature of entering into a marriage contract and getting married. So we feel confident that there are checks and balances to ensure that individuals will not be coerced into marriage, not forced into marriage, that they are entering it of their own free will and understand the nature of the arrangements they are entering into. So no, Mr. Speaker, we do not see any concerns at this time. If the member is aware of any situations, I'd be happy to review those situations. But at this time, given that we have gone through this process, we have unanimous consent, we are not intending to change the legislation again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Tadara Cassie member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of any marriages that have occurred since 2006 at least of minors in the Northwest Territories. So I'm just wondering why, again, this is required. It seems like the department's put a lot of thought into putting safeguards around it, but if no one's using this section of the bill, why does it need to be there? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the legislation has only been live and active for 1 year. Actually, it'll be 1 year on June 1st. It is consistent with the Civil Marriages Act from the federal government And we want to be prepared should and if any minors do desire to get married, that there is a process that is fair and open to them. So we are not planning to change the legislation at this point. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Nodere Ekasi, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we're on the subject of this bill, I've received some correspondence from several marriage commissioners in the Northwest Territories who feel that there are sections of the bill that don't speak to the changing regulatory environment they're working in, specifically around marriage fees. Can the minister confirm if they were marriage commissioners were consulted in the bill and if their concerns were taken into account when the bill was brought forward before the House? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, as with most of our legislation, we did go out and consult with stakeholders who had an interest in that legislation, individuals who were involved in issuing licenses and others. We did talk to clergy who have the ability to provide marriage licenses within the legislation. Committee did have an opportunity to conduct a review of that legislation. We were working to comply with federal legislation, as I've indicated several times, the Civil Marriages Act, that is a federal piece of legislation. If the member has some specifics, I'm always open to hear about those specifics, concerns raised by his constituents, and to work to address those where appropriate. But at this point, we have no indication that a piece of legislation that received unanimous consent in this House just over a year ago and is now active for just under a year requires changes. But as with all legislation, I'm open to anything. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For a question, Ikeda Cannon, the member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up on my member statement on the partnership formed by this government with the Royal Military College, my first question to the Minister of Infrastructure: I understand the Department of Infrastructure has sponsored or supported engineering projects with the Royal Military College of Canada. What is the aim of this sponsorship and what expectations does the department have? Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Infrastructure fully understands the engineering and project delivery of the North, the challenges that we have around that. And one way we feel to be successful is we expose young engineers and technical students to in their formative years to real-life northern issues, and they get fully involved and be part of it. We have arranged with southern universities, a number of them. I could probably name them all, but there's 4 or 5 of them: the University of Calgary, Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier, and the Royal Military, as the member stated today. And roughly about 150 students and their staff have come to the North and worked on engineering projects. When they do come here, we expect them to spend about 200 hours of research and formulation of viable solutions to the problems, and we expect them to work as a team and learn how to plan and organize their time. We also expect them to gain a better understanding and knowledge of the North and the unique northern environment and challenges of engineering projects in the North. And I think this work is very valuable, not only to them, but to us as the Northwest Territories, and we will continue to support that, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Ikeda Ekasi, member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that response. It's good to hear that the department is reaching out to other universities to provide on-the-job training. My next question, what was the nature of the projects and what have we obtained from the students? Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We wanted these projects to match real-life issues that and the challenges that we face in the Northwest Territories, and so sample the engineering design staff experience every day in our departments. So we've had them have a look at a couple of things. The Slave Geological Province alignment, health monitoring of the Decho Bridge, route alignment for the new winter road to Delaney, repair options for airports at the Hay River, Yellowknife, and Nuvik runways as we have challenges around them, and options for Highway 3 and possible options for permafrost as well. One thing about having these students up here, it's always good to have a fresh set of eyes on these projects, And these students have given us a wide range of ideas over the last few years, and they have actually assisted us in solving some of the problems that the department has had. But at the same time, when they're up here, particularly the Royal Military College, D&D has had them look at a number of issues that they face in the Northwest Territories. So they get a good, true picture of what's going on in the NWT and the challenges that we have, and particularly around some of these climate change issues and alignment issues. And they're a great asset, and we welcome them back here anytime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade, Council Member Satu.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that reply there. It's good to see that we're reaching out on a care and maintenance for other assets owned by this government within our territory. My third question, will there be any available or recruitment of current NWT engineering students participating into these programs for these particular projects? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think one of the concepts around this whole idea of inviting these Southern engineering students to come participate in NWT is to expose them, no different than the tourism industry and no different than many of people that we know in the NWT. They come here and they think they're going to stay for a day or two, and some of them end up spending a lifetime here. So we're hoping that this is an opportunity to recruit some of these people at the same time, exposing them to the NWT and the people of the Northwest Territories and the challenges that we have. And we welcome the opportunity to hire any of them that want to come north that fit the criteria for jobs that we have posted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Ikeda, County, the member Tunade, Willade.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is sort of a difficult way to trying to get through to how to move some of the money from the larger centers into a small community. So it's kind of all over. So I just had to kind of pick a minister that I wanted to ask. I'm talking about the school in Deda that's not moving up the line. There's a health center in Tlutzalke. So I'd like to, I guess, focus in on the long-term cares that were approved in Inuvik and Hay River and more in Yellowknife. And I'd like to ask the Minister of Health and Social Services why the department didn't go more into looking at allowing seniors to age in place. It's a much cheaper model and much more acceptable for the citizens of the NWT. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I accept fully that helping seniors age in place is the best way to go, and we want to support seniors aging in their homes, in their communities, in their regions as much as possible. But as we have discussed several times in this House, even as we continue to make progress in supporting aging in place, there are times and there are individuals who will ultimately need care that is not available in their homes. They will need 24/7 type care that is offered in the level 3-4 long-term care facilities that we are constructing here in the Northwest Territories. We did do a thorough plan on the demands of long-term care, which identified 258 bed shortages, building upon today's existing bed shortages that will exist by 2026. Those numbers were conservative and recognized and accounted for us doing more to support people to age in place in their communities. The demand is there, even though we intend to and are making progress on supporting to age in place. So we haven't forgotten what the member is saying. We agree with the member saying, but there is the reality that long-term care is already a shortage and will continue to grow even as we do more to age in place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakirade, Council Member Tunade, Willade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, several years ago, before I was in this House, the decision was made by Health and Social Services to move away from facilities where individuals were not necessarily aging in place in their own homes, but aging in place in their own community. So they had some health facilities, like what we refer to as seniors' homes, and those units were shut down. Anyone that didn't have more than 10 beds were shut down, and they've kind of gone to a more central model in the larger centers. I'd like to ask the minister if the minister would re-examine that decision. That decision, I think, was a wrong decision, and we felt the impacts in both Hutzalke and Port Resolution, where individuals had to move from their community because that level could not be provided in their own home, but could be provided with a bit of an upgrade in nursing and other types of services that could be brought in there. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health and Social Services if he would examine that long decision that was made long before he became Minister of closing down those senior citizens' homes and reopening those as long-term care facilities. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a continuing care action plan that we've released, and I know the member has seen, where we want to support families and communities to help seniors stay in their homes, first and foremost, as much as possible, because all evidence suggests that the outcomes for our residents are better the longer they can stay in their homes. But to the member's point, yes, we do know that there are times when an individual will need a greater level of support, or they may not be able to maintain a home, although they are still able to live independently. To that end, thank goodness that the NWT Housing Corporation has stood up and has worked with communities across the Northwest Territories to put in independent living units for seniors. Often these units are more apartment-like, where individuals can live in an apartment setting where they don't have to worry about some of the normal activities of maintaining a home. We feel that fills the gap that the member is talking about. We applaud the Housing Corp, who have worked with Health and Social Services to expand some of the space in these independent living units that will allow our healthcare staff to come in, home care staff and other supporters who can provide some support and activities of daily living for the seniors who are living in these independent living units. But at that end, Mr. Speaker, we also know that some of the individuals will not be able to stay in those facilities indefinitely, and they may need long-term care. So I feel like we've already moved in the direction the member has talked about with support of this House to put more independent living units out there for seniors and communities throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tada Kasi member Tuna de Wolade.
Speaker, I agree that those are important facilities as well, and that does extend the life of the individuals that are to extend the time in when these seniors will be able to remain in their home. Some of the decisions that I'm talking about was for, to be very specific, if we were to look at the Great Ellis facility in Port Resolution, that if we were able to use those 4 units, we could be extending the time when the individuals stay in that community for an additional 10 years perhaps. And instead of going from in their own home where I'm not seeing the effort that the minister's talking about, I'm not seeing that in the community. I'm not seeing a whole bunch of units becoming barrier-free, as an example. And I'm talking about turning units barrier-free of people that are 70 years old. And instead of moving into long-term care when they're 80, they would move into long-term care when they're 90 years old, for example, an extension of 10 years. So I'd like to ask the minister if he could, again, look at that, recognizing what's in place, but adding to that through aging in place and looking at those facilities that were previously shut down. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Continuing Care Action Plan isn't just a Department of Health and Social Services action plan. It does recognize that these challenges are across departments, and the Housing Corporation is a solid partner on trying to find solutions for our residents to stay in their communities as long as possible. I hear the member, and I will certainly continue to have dialogue with the minister responsible for the Housing Corporation about where we can look at incorporating or building new or more independent living units for seniors. Starting in the last government, we made commitments for 5 communities. I believe most of those are now done. I think Fort McPherson is one of the communities that's still being constructed. Fort Good Hope should be finished soon. I believe Wati, Aklavik, and I'm blanking on the last one, have already been done. But I take the member's point completely. I agree with the member. I think we all do. The obvious challenge is making sure that we have the capital resources to help bring those independent living units to communities throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Nundere Kasi member Tuna de Wolade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just along the same line of capital, maybe not specific to seniors, however, right now there's a great capital project going on in Fruits Healthcare where they're completely renovating a school. It looks absolutely beautiful, by the way, and now it's time to renovate or retrofit the health center or replace it. So there's an opportunity now, right at the heels of the project on the Fruits Healthcare Denny School being completed. I'd like to ask the Minister if he's prepared to start having beginning discussions with government, not necessarily Housing Corporation, but with the government to ensure that we can do something very strategic that would, in that community to transition from that one project at the school right to the health center as soon as possible. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think during the capital review last year, as well as the O&M review in January or February, March, I did indicate to the member that we've basically done the work on the planning around the renovations on the Lutzel K Health Center, and we're hoping to submit those for consideration in our capital planning process. I certainly will take the members' comments and share them with the Minister of Infrastructure and the Minister of Finance. But as the member knows, all projects are competing for the same capital dollars. We know it needs to get done. It's in the queue. We will do our best to make an argument to make it happen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's see. Time for our question has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Industry, Tourism, and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Northwest Territories Petroleum Resource, A Path to Northern Benefits and Energy Security. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled NWT Indigenous Languages Action Plan, A Shared Responsibility 2018 to 2022. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 3, Bracket 2 of the Public Service Act, I wish to table the following document entitled Public Service Annual Report 2016-2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to table the following document. Tlicho leadership supports Tlicho workers in potential Acadie layoff dispute, dated May the 24th, 2018. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Tuesday, May 29th, 2018, I will move the following motion. Now, therefore, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Decho, that the 18th Legislative Assembly recommends that the Tobacco Control Act be amended to include a prohibition on smoking in a vehicle when a minor is present, and further, that the Government of the Northwest Territories respond to this motion within 120 days. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading.
I give notice that on Tuesday, May 29, 2018, I will move that Bill 19, excuse me, an act to amend the Revolving Funds Act be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 1-18.3. Minister Statement 19-18.3 with Member Hay River North in the chair.
I now call the Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Mr. Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion on the floor to report progress. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister Statement 1-18 brackets 3 and Minister Statement 19-18 brackets 3 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Frame Lake? Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day from Monday, May 28, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports to standing and special committees, reports of committees and the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, bills 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. Second reading of bills, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Minister Statement 1-18.3, Minister Statement 19-18.3. Report of Committee of the Whole. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Monday, May 28, 2018, 1:30 p.m.